There is a moment in the life of every dominant power when its greatest advantages stop behaving like shields and begin acting like traps. At first, no one calls it decline. Not the generals, not the bankers, not the citizens who still see full supermarkets, bright screens, and flags on government buildings. The rituals of power continue. The currency still clears, the market still open, the speeches still promise. But history is not impressed by ceremony. History watches balance sheets, and again the same invisible fracture appears, long before the headlines do. An empire starts spending the future to keep the present unchanged. The public imagines collapse as something that arrives from the outside, an invasion, a humiliating defeat, a foreign army marching through a capital. In reality, the more common ending is quieter and more clinical. A great state does not fall because it loses one battle. It falls because it loses the ability to pay for the world it built. That is not poetry. It is mechanics. When a superpower becomes responsible for maintaining order across oceans, guaranteeing shipping lanes, underwriting allies, policing rival regions, deterring multiple threats at once, its strategy begins to resemble a promise with no expiration date. And promises without expiration dates have a name in economics: liabilities. At the peak, those liabilities are disguised by privilege. The dominant currency is treated as a universal instrument. The empire can borrow cheaply, import what it needs, and finance the cost of global posture with paper claims that the world accepts as near sacred. For a while, that arrangement feels like a law of nature. Then the arithmetic changes. The first lesson of imperial decline is that power is not merely possessed. It is maintained daily through productive capacity, social cohesion, and credible money. If those three weaken, the fourth, military reach, does not remain a separate category. It becomes a bill. Consider how past giants discovered this too late. Spain, intoxicated by New World bullion, learned that treasure can behave like a narcotic. A flood of silver can finance wars and buy loyalty, but it can also hollow out domestic industry, seduce elites into contempt for work, and turn a nation into a conduit through which wealth passes rather than a machine that creates it. The empire looked invincible while the metal arrived. The weakness revealed itself when the flow slowed and obligations remained. Britain, master of global finance for a century, learned a different version of the same rule. A reserve currency is not just a symbol, it is a discipline. When war and debt strain that discipline, the world demands proof, not tradition. In moments of monetary stress, like the early 1930s when Britain's commitment to fixed monetary credibility broke and sterling weakened sharply, the psychological spell of permanence begins to lift. The Soviet Union learned yet another variant, that tanks and rockets cannot substitute for an economy capable of innovation, incentives, and adaptation. A state can devote an extraordinary share of national resources to military competition. Cold War estimates commonly put Soviet defense burden in the neighborhood of the mid-teens as a percentage of output, yet still fail if the underlying system cannot produce abundance and legitimacy. Different ideologies, different centuries, different technologies, same skeleton beneath the skin. Overextension, monetary strain, debt pressure, erosion of production, social fatigue. Those are not stages in a documentary. They are stresses in a structure. Load the structure long enough and it does not gently sag. It snaps. Now bring that lens to the present. The United States is still the central actor in the global system, and its strengths are real. Deep capital markets, technological leadership in critical sectors, alliances that amplify reach, and a currency that remains the world's principal settlement instrument. But those strengths can also mask accumulating cost, until the cost becomes visible all at once. Start with the simplest measurement: obligations. The U.S. federal balance sheet is carrying debt on the scale of tens of trillions. By early September 2025, total federal debt was reported around $37.4 trillion, roughly 123% of GDP by that measure. That is not a moral failing. It is a strategic fact. And strategic facts have consequences when interest rates rise and refinancing becomes a permanent operation rather than an occasional tool. Interest, in other words, becomes a rival superpower inside the budget. Budget projections have pointed to annual net interest costs pressing toward the high hundreds of billions, around $951 billion in F 2025 projections. numbers that compete with major national priorities. This is what mature debt dynamics look like. You do not merely fund programs, you fund the past. Meanwhile, the military instrument, still unmatched in many categories, must be sustained across a global footprint that no previous empire attempted at comparable technological intensity. The official budget request for U.S. defense in FY 2025 was about $850 billion. That figure is not simply spending, it is the price of maintaining the posture of primacy in a world that is no longer unipolar, and there is a second bill that arrives quietly every day, the bill of production. A nation can lead the world in design, software, finance, and intellectual property, and still become vulnerable if it cannot reliably manufacture essential goods, secure supply chains, and maintain industrial depth under stress. Trade is not just commerce, it is dependence measured in containers. In 2024, the U.S. goods and services trade deficit was $918.4 billion. That number is not inherently catastrophic, but in a geopolitically fractured world, persistent external deficits can become strategic exposure, especially when paired with fiscal deficits at home. This is the hinge of the thesis. A superpower does not fall because it becomes poor in an absolute sense. It falls because it becomes unable to reconcile its global role with its domestic foundations. When a country must finance security commitments, social promises, and debt service, while also rebuilding industrial resilience and social trust, the margin for error shrinks. And when the margin for error shrinks, the system becomes sensitive to shocks, a sudden energy spike, a financial accident, a geopolitical miscalculation, a confidence event in currency markets. Confidence is the most dangerous variable of all, because it does not decline like a glacier. It flips like a switch. For decades, the dollar's centrality has functioned as an amplifier of American power. It lowers borrowing costs, increases strategic flexibility, and allows the U.S. to run larger external and fiscal imbalances than most nations could tolerate. That privilege is not magic. It is a contract, an unspoken agreement between America and the world that U.S. obligations remain the cleanest shirt in a dirty laundry basket. But contracts can be renegotiated by reality. If debt expands faster than productive renewal, if political paralysis convinces partners that long-term discipline is unattainable, if domestic cohesion fractures to the point where policy becomes a pendulum rather than a plan, then even allies begin to hedge. Not necessarily with dramatic announcements, with small adjustments, incremental diversification, quiet substitutions, institutional risk management. And that is how reserve status erodes in real life. Not with a headline, but with 1,000 routine decisions. The uncomfortable point is not that collapse is guaranteed. History is not fate, it is pressure and probability. The uncomfortable point is that great powers tend to recognize the pattern only when the pattern has already taken root, because the early symptoms look like politics, not physics. By the time the symptoms feel like physics, the choice is narrow. In the next part of this analysis, we will move from backdrop to brink. How monetary privilege can reverse, why the return flow of currency can behave like a financial storm, how social fracture turns economic pain into political rupture, and what strategic reform actually means when the clock is no longer generous. Reserve currency status is often described like a crown. In practice, it functions more like a gravity field. When the world treats your money as the default asset, your deficits do not behave like other countries' deficits. Your borrowing costs stay lower than they should be. Your external shortfalls are financed more easily than they deserve. Your financial system becomes the world's clearinghouse, and that role quietly subsidizes your statecraft. But gravity fields can weaken at the edges long before the center notices. Not because someone declares a new order, because risk. Managers, central banks, and trade desks begin to behave differently. That shift is rarely dramatic. It is bureaucratic. It is procedural. It is incremental. A reserve system erodes the way a shoreline erodes, one unremarkable tide at a time, until a storm arrives and everyone realizes the coastline moved. The most measurable sign is not a headline about the end of the dollar. It is the slow rebalancing of what institutions choose to hold. The International Monetary Fund's COFR data is a thermometer for that behavior. In 2025, the US dollar still accounted for the majority share of allocated global foreign exchange reserves, about 56.32%. with the euro around 21.13% in the same release. That is not collapse. That is continued dominance. But it is also not the complacent peak of a prior era. It is a signal that the world is, at minimum, keeping its options open. And options are how confidence leaves without making a sound. The second sign is the quiet return of an ancient asset to modern balance sheets: gold. When central banks buy gold, they are not investing the way a household invests. They are changing their view of political risk. They are choosing an asset without a counterparty, an asset that does not depend on any government's future discipline. In 2024, central banks were reported to have bought roughly 1,045 tons of gold net, an extraordinary scale by modern standards. That does not mean they are abandoning the dollar tomorrow. It means they are widening the escape routes. The third sign is the fragmentation of payment plumbing. Even if the dollar remains the dominant reserve asset, trade and payments can become more multipolar over time. The global system doesn't need a dramatic replacement. It can simply become less singular. Swift's renminbi tracker shows the Chinese RMB's share of global payments by value moving with volatility rather than straight line ascent, around 2.47% in October 2025 by that report, and about 1.87% when excluding intra-Eurozone payments. Those are not numbers that dethrone anything, but they are numbers that remind you of the direction of travel. Not one new king, but many competing instruments. Not a clean succession, but an unruly crowd. Now, here is the strategic danger most people miss. Reserve status does not end when another currency becomes bigger. Reserve status ends when the dominant currency becomes politically unreliable as a long-term promise. That unreliability has two main sources: fiscal arithmetic and internal cohesion. Start with fiscal arithmetic. When debt climbs and interest costs rise, the government begins to experience a form of strategic suffocation. It can still act, but each action becomes more expensive. It can still respond to crises, but each response increases the baseline burden. The state starts paying more to stand still. In the United States, net interest costs have surged into territory that competes with the country's core. Priorities. CBO projections and related analyses have put net interest in 2025 around $952 billion and show it rising further over the coming decade under baseline assumptions. This matters because it changes political behavior. It makes every budget fight more vicious. It makes promises harder to honor. It makes emergency spending feel like existential theft from the future. And when the future becomes a contested resource, societies begin to fracture into rival moral economies, each side convinced the other side is looting the nation. That brings us to internal cohesion. A superpower can survive bad years. It can survive lost wars. It can even survive bitter recessions. What it cannot survive indefinitely is a steady collapse of shared reality, where institutions lose legitimacy and the population no longer believes sacrifice will be reciprocated. Social strain is not an aesthetic issue. It is a national security variable. Consider homelessness. On a single night in 2024, the U.S. counted roughly 480 people experiencing homelessness, with a large unsheltered population. This is not merely a statistic. It is a signal of housing market stress, governance limits, and widening precarity. Consider demography. CDC reporting on fertility shows the United States with a total fertility rate far below replacement. Provisional estimates around 1.626 births per woman for 2024 in one release. Even with year-to-year fluctuations, the strategic implication remains. A society with aging demographics and low fertility must rely more heavily on productivity growth and immigration policy to sustain dynamism. If it fails at both, it becomes economically heavier and politically more brittle. Consider public health. CDC communications in early 2025 highlighted a sharp decline in overdose deaths in the 12 months ending September 2024, but also underlined how rapidly the situation can shift as data updates and local dynamics change. This is the broader point. A society fighting complex internal crises cannot fund global primacy with the same ease. The empire's attention becomes divided, and divided attention is expensive. Now connect all of this to the core mechanism of abrupt decline. The hazard is not that America slowly becomes less rich. The hazard is a confidence event that turns privilege into pressure. Here is what that can look like, mechanically, not melodramatically. First, some combination of fiscal stress and political paralysis convinces major holders that U.S. policy is drifting toward either higher inflation tolerance, financial repression, or recurring brinkmanship. They do not panic sell. They simply shorten duration. They reduce marginal purchases. They diversify incrementally. Second, those marginal shifts raise refinancing costs, not necessarily to catastrophic levels, but enough to tighten the budget's oxygen. Interest costs climb faster than expected. Domestic politics hardens. The state becomes less able to spend its way out of shocks. Third, in a moment of external strain, a major war scare, a banking accident, a commodity shock, the world demands higher compensation for holding long-dated U.S. liabilities. The currency may rise briefly as capital flees elsewhere into safety, but the underlying funding conditions worsen. Policymakers face a vicious trade-off: defend the currency with tighter conditions and risk recession, or ease conditions and risk inflation and credibility. Fourth, the domestic system reacts. Markets reprice risk. Households feel the squeeze. Politics becomes a tribunal. Each faction blames the other for betrayal. At that moment, what looked like a monetary problem becomes a constitutional problem, because governing becomes impossible at precisely the moment it becomes most necessary. That is why collapses feel sudden. The years before the break are full of arguments. The break itself is silent. Then everything moves at once. And that is also why the most dangerous myth is the comforting one, that the dominant power will have plenty of time. Time is what reserve status buys you, until it doesn't. So what is the strategic conclusion? Not despair, not denial, not prophecy. Strategy. The first strategic principle is to treat productive capacity as a national defense asset, a superpower that cannot reliably manufacture critical inputs, energy infrastructure components, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, precision materials, will find itself paying a strategic premium in every crisis. Industrial depth is not nostalgia, it is resilience. The second principle is to treat fiscal discipline as geopolitical power. When interest costs approach the scale of core state functions, the state becomes reactive. It loses room for maneuver. A credible plan to stabilize debt dynamics through a mix of spending restraint, revenue realism, and growth policy is not simply economics. It is the restoration of strategic freedom. The third principle is to restore institutional trust through competence, not slogans. Populations do not rally around abstract virtue when their lived experience feels unstable. Trust is rebuilt by visible delivery, housing that is buildable, infrastructure that is functional, borders that are governed, justice that is predictable, and a state that can execute. The fourth principle is alliance management without imperial overcommitment. Alliances are force multipliers only when they are reciprocal and sustainable. If commitments expand faster than the capacity to honor them, deterrence begins to rot from the inside. The goal is not retreat. The goal is coherence. Clear priorities, credible red lines, and a posture that matches resources. The fifth principle is to understand that currency credibility is an output, not an input. The dollar remains central because the U.S. still offers the world scale, liquidity, and a legal financial architecture that, despite its flaws, often looks safer than the alternatives. Preserving that advantage requires protecting the underlying foundations, predictable governance, debt sustainability, and an economy that produces as well as it consumes. Now the hard truth. None of these principles can be executed in a nation that is psychologically addicted to the comforts of primacy, because primacy is intoxicating. It makes costs feel optional. It makes trade-offs feel like insults. It makes reform feel unnecessary until reform becomes unavoidable. And that is where history becomes brutal. Empires do not usually fall because they are ignorant. They fall because they are unwilling to downgrade their self-image fast enough to match reality. A great power that chooses reform early looks weak to the impatient. A great power that refuses reform eventually becomes weak to everyone. This is the strategic crossroads the United States faces, not in a single election cycle, not in a single market week, but in the structure of its choices. If it treats debt as normal, production as optional, and cohesion as a cultural sideshow, then reserve status will gradually become less of a privilege and more of a trap, because the world will still demand dollars while also demanding higher compensation for the risk of holding them. But if it treats production as strategy, discipline as sovereignty, and cohesion as national security, then the story does not have to end with a snap. History does not guarantee rescue, but it does offer a warning that is as close to a law as politics ever gets. When a civilization tries to live permanently above its productive reality, it will eventually be forced back down, either by choice or by shock. The intelligent path is the one that accepts pain deliberately, while pain is still a tool, instead of waiting until pain becomes a weapon used by events. Because the most expensive moment to discover limits is the moment the world stops pretending you do not have them.